People don't just get lost in America's national parks. They vanish, sometimes within minutes, sometimes within sight of others. Search teams find no trail, no explanation, and no clear answers. Officials call them accidents, but the patterns say otherwise. And once you see those patterns, it becomes impossible to look away. America's national parks are built on a promise that feels unshakable. They are presented as protected environments where danger has been identified, managed, and pushed safely into the background. Millions of visitors arrive each year believing that while nature may be powerful, it is also controlled. Trails are marked, maps are provided, and authority is implied through infrastructure and uniformed presence. The message is subtle, but consistent. This wilderness is different. It is safer. This belief reshapes how people think and behave the moment they step inside park boundaries. Visitors move with confidence instead of caution. They take short detours without hesitation. They assume that visibility equals security, and that proximity to a trail equals protection. The vastness of the land feels less threatening because it exists within an organized system. The wilderness no longer feels wild. It feels supervised. That psychological comfort is where the illusion takes hold. National parks are not enclosed environments. They are enormous, complex landscapes where terrain shifts suddenly and orientation can collapse within moments. Forest density changes without warning. Elevation alters perception. Sound behaves unpredictably. Yet the belief in oversight remains stronger than the reality of geography. Visitors trust the idea of protection more than the limits of human control. Disappearances often begin inside this mental gap. There is rarely chaos or panic at the start. Everything appears normal. The person is present, engaged, and moving with intention. Then something small happens. A few steps in the wrong direction. A brief separation. A moment of distraction that feels harmless. Nothing about the moment suggests danger, which is precisely why it goes unnoticed. When absence is first detected, it does not immediately register as a crisis. Assumptions fill the silence. The person must be nearby. They know the area. They will return shortly. Time passes quietly while confidence delays action. By the time concern replaces reassurance, the environment has already absorbed the individual. The wilderness does not announce when it has taken something. It does not create clear boundaries between safety and risk. Trails that feel obvious from one direction dissolve entirely when approached from another. Landmarks shift depending on light and angle. What seemed familiar moments earlier becomes unrecognizable. The park remains visually calm, even as urgency builds. Officials often respond by framing these disappearances as understandable outcomes of individual behavior. A wrong turn. A lapse in judgment. An unfortunate but explainable mistake. Each explanation reinforces the idea that the system itself is reliable and that deviation, not design, is to blame. Responsibility is placed on the individual, allowing the broader environment to remain unquestioned. What these explanations ignore is how often the missing were doing everything right. Many followed marked paths. Many stayed within designated areas. Many were experienced, cautious, and physically capable. They were not behaving recklessly. They were participating in the park exactly as intended. The difference between them and everyone else is not action, but outcome. The illusion of safety is powerful because it discourages pattern recognition. If parks are safe by design, then disappearances must be rare anomalies. If they are anomalies, they do not require systemic examination. Each case can be isolated, documented, and archived without threatening public confidence. This approach preserves trust, but it also preserves ignorance. What remains largely unspoken is frequency. There is no single public system that shows how often people vanish inside these parks. Records are scattered across jurisdictions, buried in separate reports that never converge. Without aggregation, scale disappears. Without scale, concern fades. And without concern, questions are never fully asked. The wilderness itself is not hostile. It does not act with intent. Its danger lies in indifference. It does not respond to expectations, beliefs, or assurances. When human confidence collides with environmental unpredictability, outcomes are decided without negotiation. Yet the system surrounding these parks continues to project certainty, even when certainty cannot be guaranteed. Visitors are encouraged to explore, but rarely encouraged to question the limits of protection. Maps simplify terrain. Trails imply direction. Boundaries suggest control. These tools are useful, but they are not safeguards. They cannot account for every variable, every decision, every moment when perception fails. Believing that they can is what sustains the illusion. Admitting uncertainty would require redefining how these spaces are presented. It would mean acknowledging that protection has limits, and that some disappearances resist explanation. That admission would force uncomfortable conversations about responsibility, oversight, and risk. It would challenge the narrative that these landscapes are not only beautiful, but reliably safe, so the illusion persists. It must, because once that illusion weakens, disappearances stop feeling random. They stop feeling isolated. They begin to feel connected, unresolved, and deeply unsettling. And when safety itself becomes a question instead of an assumption, the wilderness takes on a far more troubling meaning. Because once the promise of safety begins to collapse, the disappearances no longer ask where people went. They ask why the answers were never found. Disappearances inside national parks become deeply unsettling when they refuse to behave like ordinary accidents. These are not cases where someone wandered too far or ignored clear warnings. Instead, they unfold without logic, without escalation, and without visible cause. The person is present one moment, functioning normally, and then absent the next. There is no transition phase that suggests danger was approaching. The shift from presence to absence is abrupt and unexplained. What makes these disappearances so difficult to accept is how quickly they occur. In several cases, individuals vanish within minutes, sometimes within sight of others. They are not alone in remote backcountry or far beyond help. They are moving with purpose, often on familiar terrain, when something interrupts the normal flow of events. That interruption leaves no trace strong enough to explain what followed. Personal belongings often complicate the narrative. Items essential for movement or survival are frequently found undisturbed. Shoes remain near trails. Equipment is discovered neatly placed rather than discarded in panic. These details directly contradict assumptions of fear-driven behavior. People who feel threatened do not calmly abandon critical items, yet the evidence repeatedly suggests no struggle, no urgency, and no attempt to signal distress. Tracking efforts add another layer of confusion. Search teams deploy trained dogs capable of following scent across difficult terrain. In many of these cases, the scent does not fade gradually. It stops abruptly, as if the trail simply ends. This sudden loss challenges conventional explanations and forces investigators to confront the limits of their methods. The environment provides no answers, only absence. Weather patterns often shift shortly after disappearances, further distorting timelines. Clear skies give way to storms. Temperatures drop unexpectedly. Visibility collapses. While weather alone does not erase a person, it consistently interferes with recovery efforts at critical moments. The timing feels less like coincidence and more like an obstacle that compounds uncertainty. Officials typically respond with broad explanations that emphasize unpredictability. Nature is complex. Terrain is challenging. Accidents happen. These statements are technically true, but they do not address the specific contradictions present in these cases. They offer closure without clarity, resolution without understanding. What remains unspoken is how often experienced professionals express confusion behind closed doors. Investigators trained to recognize patterns find themselves facing scenarios that do not align with known models of behavior or movement. The absence of logical progression leaves them with conclusions that feel incomplete, even to those responsible for recording them. The emotional impact of these disappearances extends beyond families. Searchers, volunteers, and rangers carry the weight of unresolved outcomes. They remember the moments when logic failed them, the areas searched repeatedly, the silence where answers should have been. These experiences linger, shaping an unspoken awareness that not everything fits established explanations. What makes these cases particularly troubling is their consistency. The details change, but the structure remains the same. Sudden absence, minimal evidence, abrupt dead ends. Each case alone can be rationalized. Together, they form a pattern that resists dismissal. Public narratives rarely connect these events. Media coverage isolates incidents, framing them as unfortunate but unrelated. This fragmentation prevents broader scrutiny. Without connection, there is no urgency to investigate deeper causes or systemic issues. The result is a growing collection of unanswered questions, hidden beneath official summaries. These disappearances challenge assumptions about predictability and control. They expose gaps between what is expected to happen and what actually occurs. And they leave behind a discomfort that cannot be resolved through simple explanations. The longer these cases remain unexplored as a group, the more difficult they become to ignore. Because when logic fails repeatedly in the same ways, the problem is no longer individual behavior. It becomes something far more complex and far more troubling. And once these impossible disappearances are examined together, the similarities become too precise to dismiss as coincidence. When disappearances inside national parks are examined individually, they appear random and unrelated. Each case carries its own circumstances, its own timeline, and its own explanation. But when these cases are placed side by side, a different picture begins to emerge. Patterns surface quietly, not through speculation, but through repetition. These similarities are not dramatic enough to demand immediate attention. Yet they are consistent enough to raise serious concern. One of the most striking elements is the type of individual who disappears. These are often people in good physical condition, mentally alert, and capable of handling outdoor environments. They are not typically impaired, reckless, or unaware of their surroundings. Many are confident in their abilities, familiar with basic navigation, and prepared for the terrain they enter. This alone challenges the assumption that disappearances are primarily the result of inexperience. Separation plays a recurring role, but not in the way commonly imagined. Victims are rarely lost for extended periods before vanishing. Instead, they are often only briefly apart from others. The distance is small enough to feel insignificant. A few steps ahead, a momentary pause, a short detour that should pose no risk. This limited separation appears again and again, marking the precise moment when presence turns into absence. Age patterns also emerge. While disappearances affect all age groups, certain ranges appear more frequently in unexplained cases. These individuals are neither too young to navigate nor too old to keep pace. They fall into a category where vulnerability is not immediately obvious. This makes their disappearance more difficult to rationalize and easier to overlook as accidental. Environmental features further reinforce the pattern. Rocky areas, sudden elevation changes, and proximity to water consistently appear near disappearance points. These locations are not inherently dangerous, yet they recur with surprising regularity. The terrain itself seems to play a role, not as a cause, but as a common backdrop. This repetition across vastly different parks suggests something beyond coincidence. Clothing details add another layer of inconsistency. In cases where individuals are later located, clothing does not always align with expected behavior or environmental conditions. Items essential for warmth or movement may be missing, while less practical items remain. These inconsistencies resist simple explanations and complicate official conclusions. Timing also matters. Many disappearances occur during daylight hours, when visibility is high and navigation should be easiest. This contradicts assumptions that darkness or poor conditions are primary contributors. The environment appears calm, manageable, and familiar at the moment when something goes wrong. Officials rarely acknowledge these similarities publicly. Doing so would require shifting from isolated explanations to collective analysis. Patterns demand accountability. They raise questions about systemic factors rather than individual mistakes. As a result, the language used in reports remains cautious and narrow. Words like coincidence and unfortunate replace deeper examination. The avoidance of pattern recognition is not necessarily malicious, but it is consequential. Without acknowledgement, similarities remain unofficial. Without official recognition, there is no mandate to investigate further. Each case remains confined to its own file, disconnected from others that share the same unsettling traits. What makes this avoidance more troubling is geographic consistency. These patterns appear in parks separated by thousands of miles, across different climates, ecosystems, and management structures. The variables change, but the outcomes do not. This repetition challenges the idea that local conditions alone explain these disappearances. Families often sense these patterns long before officials do. As they search for answers, they encounter stories that feel uncomfortably familiar. The same explanations, the same delays, the same unanswered questions. Their experiences reinforce the impression that something larger is being overlooked. The reluctance to acknowledge patterns preserves the illusion that each disappearance is unique. But uniqueness does not negate similarity. And similarity, when repeated often enough, becomes impossible to ignore. At some point, coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation. The question is not whether patterns exist, but why recognizing them feels so uncomfortable. Because once these profiles are acknowledged, the disappearances no longer seem random. They begin to suggest an underlying structure that has yet to be explained. And when these patterns are traced across multiple parks, the mystery expands from isolated incidents into something far more widespread and unsettling. When someone is reported missing inside a national park, the response is meant to be immediate and methodical. Search and rescue operations are built on structure, experience, and protocol. Teams assemble quickly, areas are mapped, and responsibilities are assigned. From the outside, these efforts appear comprehensive and reassuring. The presence of helicopters, volunteers, and uniformed personnel creates the impression that every possible measure is being taken. In the early stages, hope remains strong. The assumption is that the missing person will be located nearby, perhaps injured or disoriented but alive. Search grids are drawn based on last known position, terrain, and estimated movement. Technology is deployed to extend human reach. Every step is guided by established procedure. On paper, the system appears capable of resolving almost any situation. Yet many of these searches end without answers. Days pass. Efforts intensify. Resources multiply. And still, nothing is found. No trace that explains direction, intent, or outcome. What begins as an organized response slowly transforms into an exercise in uncertainty. The environment resists clarity. The search space expands instead of narrowing. One of the most troubling aspects is how frequently searches conclude without resolution. Official statements often emphasize effort rather than outcome. Language becomes vague. Phrases like, "no further leads," or "search area exhausted," replace concrete explanations. The end of a search is framed as a practical necessity, rather than an unresolved failure. Termination decisions are rarely explained in detail. Budget constraints, weather conditions, and diminishing probability are cited. But these reasons often feel insufficient to families and volunteers. The sense that something was missed lingers long after operations cease. Closure is replaced by absence, and absence becomes permanent. Evidence found during searches sometimes deepens confusion, instead of resolving it. Items are discovered in locations that do not align with expected movement patterns. Footprints appear briefly and then disappear. Personal belongings surface without context. These findings are documented, but often left unexplored. They exist as facts without interpretation. Volunteers who participate in these searches frequently describe a disconnect between field experience and official summaries. Areas believed to be thoroughly searched later produce discoveries. Zones marked as low probability reveal unexpected clues. This inconsistency undermines confidence in the process and raises uncomfortable questions about what is truly known. The emotional toll on searchers is significant. Many enter these operations driven by a sense of purpose and responsibility. They expect resolution. When searches end without answers, that purpose dissolves into frustration. The memory of unsearched terrain, unanswered signals, and unresolved possibilities remains. For families, the conclusion of a search marks a devastating shift. Active hope gives way to uncertainty. The presence of search teams had offered reassurance that everything possible was being done. Their departure signals something far more unsettling: that the system has reached its limit, even if the truth has not been found. Officials often stress that the wilderness is unpredictable, and that not all outcomes can be controlled. While this is true, it does not fully explain why some searches fail so completely. The lack of clear explanation creates a vacuum where doubt grows. When logic and effort fail to produce results, confidence in both begins to erode. What makes these unresolved searches particularly troubling is how often they share the same characteristics. Extensive effort, minimal results, quiet conclusion. Each case reinforces the impression that the system encounters scenarios it is not equipped to understand, let alone resolve. Public attention fades quickly once a search ends. Media coverage diminishes. The case slips from headlines into archives. Without resolution, there is no narrative to sustain interest. The disappearance becomes a statistic rather than a story. This silence benefits institutions, but it leaves families suspended in uncertainty. Over time, unresolved searches accumulate. Each one represents not just a missing person, but a failure to explain what happened. When viewed collectively, these outcomes suggest limitations that go beyond terrain or weather. They point toward gaps in understanding that remain unaddressed. The purpose of search operations is not only to find the missing, but to provide answers. When both objectives fail, the result is not closure, but discomfort. A recognition that effort does not always equal understanding, and that some disappearances resist resolution entirely. And in some cases, the story does not end when the search stops, because years later, the missing are found in places that were already searched. For some disappearances, the search does not end in silence. It ends with discovery. But instead of providing closure, these discoveries often deepen the mystery in ways that are difficult to explain. Bodies are found months or even years later, sometimes in locations that had already been searched extensively. These recoveries do not resolve questions. They multiply them. What immediately draws attention is location. Many remains are discovered in areas that were previously considered low probability or fully cleared. These are not hidden caves or unreachable ravines. In some cases, they are relatively open areas where visibility should have been clear. The idea that a body could remain unnoticed through multiple search efforts challenges assumptions about thoroughness and accuracy. Time becomes another point of conflict. The condition of remains often does not align neatly with official timelines. Exposure alone does not always explain preservation or deterioration patterns. Weather, scavenging, and terrain are cited, but inconsistencies remain. The body appears where logic says it should not be, at a time that does not fully make sense. Clothing details add further confusion. Some recovered individuals are missing critical garments, while other items remain intact. Shoes, jackets, or equipment expected to be nearby are absent without explanation. In other instances, clothing appears cleaner or more intact than environmental exposure would suggest. These details resist simple conclusions and complicate official reports. Autopsy findings rarely provide clarity. Causes of death are often listed in broad terms that avoid specificity. Exposure is cited, even when circumstances do not fully support it. In many cases, determining an exact cause becomes impossible. The lack of precision leaves room for doubt, but official summaries move quickly toward closure. For families, recovery is expected to bring answers. Instead, it often delivers a new set of questions. Why here? Why now? How was this location missed? These questions linger without response. The return of a loved one should mark the end of uncertainty, yet it often intensifies it. Officials typically emphasize finality after recovery. Cases are closed. Files are archived. The discovery itself becomes the conclusion. But for those examining the details, the conclusion feels premature. Too many inconsistencies remain unexplored. Too many assumptions replace investigation. One of the most troubling aspects is how often recovered bodies appear to contradict earlier search conclusions. Areas labeled as thoroughly searched later produce remains. Terrain considered inaccessible proves reachable. These contradictions undermine confidence in prior assessments and raise concerns about overlooked variables. Silence often follows recovery. Media attention spikes briefly, then fades. The public assumes resolution where none truly exists. The discovery satisfies curiosity without addressing underlying uncertainty. The story appears complete, even when it is not. Patterns begin to form here as well. Delayed recovery, previously searched locations, inconclusive findings. These elements repeat across multiple cases. Each instance can be rationalized individually, but together they suggest something systematic rather than accidental. The wilderness itself cannot explain these outcomes alone. Terrain does not relocate remains. Time does not account for all inconsistencies. The environment may obscure, but it does not clarify. The unanswered questions persist, because the framework used to explain them is insufficient. For investigators, these cases present uncomfortable challenges. A recovery is supposed to validate the search process. Instead, it often exposes its limitations. The discovery raises doubts about assumptions that were once considered reliable. Yet those doubts rarely reach official narratives. Families are left navigating a strange space between closure and uncertainty. The physical return of a loved one contrasts sharply with the absence of understanding. Grief becomes complicated by unanswered questions that refuse to settle. Recovered bodies should mark the end of a story. In these cases, they often mark the beginning of a deeper mystery. They force a reevaluation of what is known and what is assumed. They reveal gaps that cannot be easily dismissed. The most unsettling realization is that recovery does not always equal resolution. Sometimes, it confirms that something occurred which cannot be fully explained. And when explanations fail repeatedly in similar ways, the discomfort grows. Because if bodies can reappear where they should not exist, then the question is no longer how people vanished, but what prevented the truth from being found sooner. One of the most overlooked aspects of disappearances inside national parks is not what is recorded, but what is missing entirely. There is no single, public, centralized system that tracks every person who has vanished within these protected lands. Instead, information is fragmented, scattered across agencies that rarely coordinate beyond immediate necessity. What should be a unified record becomes a patchwork of partial files and incomplete data. Jurisdiction plays a critical role in this silence. National parks fall under federal authority, but missing persons cases often involve local law enforcement, state agencies, and volunteer organizations. Each entity documents events according to its own standards, priorities, and limitations. When a case ends without resolution, responsibility dissolves across bureaucratic boundaries. No single institution is obligated to preserve the full story. As time passes, Records become harder to access. Reports are archived, summarized, or redacted. Details that once seemed insignificant disappear from official memory. Requests for information are met with delays or partial responses. Families seeking clarity encounter procedural obstacles that feel impersonal and exhausting. The absence of transparency becomes an additional burden layered onto loss. This silence is rarely framed as intentional. Officials often describe it as a consequence of complexity. Too many agencies, too many variables, too many years. Yet complexity does not explain why no effort exists to consolidate information or identify recurring trends. The lack of a comprehensive database ensures that similarities remain unofficial and easily dismissed. Without aggregation, scale remains invisible. A single disappearance can be explained away. Multiple disappearances across decades begin to suggest something else entirely. But without accessible records, that broader view never fully materializes. Each case remains isolated, stripped of context, and quietly absorbed into institutional routine. Families frequently describe feeling excluded from the process meant to help them. Information arrives slowly, if at all. Key details are withheld or obscured. The sense that answers exist somewhere, but remain inaccessible creates a form of uncertainty that never resolves. Silence becomes a presence, shaping every interaction. Public accountability suffers as a result. Without data, there is no benchmark for success or failure. Search outcomes cannot be compared. Patterns cannot be confirmed. Questions cannot be quantified. The absence of information protects systems from scrutiny, while leaving individuals without resolution. Media coverage rarely challenges this silence. Stories focus on the emotional impact of disappearance, not the administrative gaps that follow. Once attention fades, so does pressure. The lack of sustained inquiry allows institutional silence to persist unchallenged. Over time, this silence becomes normalized. Disappearances are treated as unfortunate, but inevitable aspects of wilderness management. The absence of answers is accepted as the cost of operating in unpredictable environments. Yet unpredictability does not require opacity. Silence is a choice, even when it is disguised as necessity. What remains troubling is how consistently this silence appears across different parks and cases. The same obstacles, the same delays, the same incomplete records. This repetition suggests that the issue is not isolated failure, but structural design. A system that does not prioritize long-term understanding cannot produce it. The result is a growing gap between what is known and what is acknowledged. Information exists, but it is not assembled. Questions are raised, but not pursued. Silence fills the space where explanation should be, and silence has consequences. It prevents learning. It discourages improvement. It allows unresolved cases to accumulate without reflection. The wilderness does not demand secrecy. The systems surrounding it impose it. At its core, this silence reshapes the narrative. Disappearances become personal tragedies rather than systemic concerns. Responsibility shifts away from institutions and toward circumstance. Without records, there is no memory. Without memory, there is no accountability. The most unsettling aspect is not that answers are missing, but that the absence of answers has become acceptable. Silence is no longer an anomaly. It is the default outcome. Because when records fall silent, the question is no longer what happened, but who benefits from not knowing. A common assumption surrounding disappearances in national parks is that preparation equals safety. Experience is believed to reduce risk. Training is assumed to provide control. Familiarity with terrain is treated as a shield against the unknown. Yet some of the most unsettling cases directly challenge this belief. Many of those who vanished were not inexperienced visitors. They were people who understood the environment, respected its dangers, and knew how to navigate it. These individuals did not enter the wilderness blindly. They planned their routes, carried appropriate gear, and followed established practices. Some had spent years exploring similar landscapes. Their confidence was not careless optimism, but earned familiarity. If anyone was equipped to handle uncertainty, it was them. And yet, they disappeared without explanation. This contradiction forces a reassessment of what experience truly offers. Skill does not eliminate unpredictability. Training prepares individuals for known risks, but it cannot account for every variable. The wilderness operates outside structured expectation. Conditions change without warning. Terrain behaves differently depending on light, weather, and perspective. What seems manageable one moment becomes disorienting the next. Experienced individuals often move with efficiency. They take calculated shortcuts. They trust their judgment when conditions appear stable. This confidence, while justified, can create exposure to situations that less experienced visitors might avoid. Independence becomes both strength and vulnerability. In several cases, equipment belonging to experienced individuals is found intact and unused. Items designed for emergency situations remain untouched. This suggests that the disappearance did not unfold gradually. There was no prolonged struggle or escalating crisis that allowed for response. The absence appears sudden, interrupting routine rather than following failure. These cases receive less public attention than expected, perhaps because they challenge comforting narratives. If experts can disappear, then safety cannot be reduced to preparation alone. Acknowledging this reality destabilizes assumptions that underpin wilderness management and public confidence. There is also an unspoken discomfort in examining these cases too closely. Experience is often used to explain away disappearances. When that explanation fails, what remains is uncertainty. And uncertainty is difficult to frame without inviting deeper questions. Some of the most troubling instances involve individuals whose professional roles placed them inside the system itself. Guides, climbers, and long-time outdoor workers vanish under circumstances similar to those of casual visitors. Their knowledge does not alter the outcome. Their familiarity does not prevent disappearance. The wilderness does not differentiate between novice and expert. This realization exposes a critical limitation. Experience prepares individuals to respond to recognizable threats. It does not guarantee awareness of every possibility. When something falls outside expected patterns, even experts are vulnerable. The equipment left behind reinforces this vulnerability. Items are discovered neatly placed, suggesting no panic or urgency. This contradicts assumptions that experienced individuals would immediately react to danger. The absence of response implies that whatever occurred did not allow for preparation or reaction. Officials often emphasize that even experts make mistakes. While true, this explanation feels insufficient when applied repeatedly. Mistakes do not account for sudden absence without evidence. They do not explain why skills fail in similar ways across different cases and locations. Families of experienced individuals struggle with this contradiction. They know the missing person was capable and cautious. Accepting explanations rooted in carelessness feels dishonest. The gap between official narratives and lived reality widens. Public perception rarely acknowledges these complexities. Experience is treated as a safeguard rather than a variable. When disappearances challenge that belief, attention shifts elsewhere. Simpler explanations are preferred. Over time, these cases accumulate quietly. Each one reinforces the idea that preparation does not equal immunity. The wilderness operates on its own terms, indifferent to expertise. Understanding this reality requires abandoning comforting assumptions. The unsettling truth is that experience may reduce risk, but it cannot eliminate uncertainty. Training prepares for known challenges, not unknown variables. When disappearances occur without warning or trace, experience offers no protection. This realization shifts the narrative from individual responsibility to environmental unpredictability. It suggests that something beyond skill and preparation influences these outcomes. And that influence remains undefined. Because if even the most experienced can vanish without explanation, then the final question is no longer who is at risk, but whether anyone is truly safe. At the center of every unresolved disappearance, inside a national park, lies a choice that is rarely discussed openly. It is not the choice made by the missing person, nor the choice made by the environment. It is the institutional choice to treat each case as isolated, temporary, and ultimately explainable. This choice shapes how disappearances are understood, documented, and remembered. Acknowledging a pattern would fundamentally alter that approach. It would require officials to move beyond individual explanations and confront the possibility of systemic uncertainty. Patterns demand comparison. Comparison invites accountability. Accountability forces change. And change carries consequences that extend far beyond any single case. One of the most immediate consequences would be public perception. National parks depend on trust. They are symbols of national pride, conservation, and safe exploration. Admitting that unexplained disappearances share similarities across decades and locations would disrupt that image. Visitors would begin to question assumptions they have long taken for granted. Safety would become a topic of discussion rather than an unspoken promise. Legal implications would follow quickly. Patterns introduce liability. They raise questions about warning systems, disclosure, and responsibility. If similarities were formally recognized, institutions would be compelled to explain why preventative measures were not implemented sooner. Silence avoids that scrutiny. Isolation deflects it. Financial consequences cannot be ignored. Tourism fuels local economies surrounding national parks. Any narrative suggesting unresolved risk threatens revenue. Acknowledging uncertainty could discourage visitation, impacting budgets and livelihoods. From an administrative perspective, maintaining confidence becomes a priority that often outweighs transparency. Media dynamics also play a role. Isolated incidents are easier to report and easier to forget. Patterns require sustained investigation. They challenge simple narratives and demand follow-up. Without official acknowledgement, journalists lack the foundation to pursue deeper inquiry. Silence limits coverage. Limited coverage preserves distance. Public awareness remains fragmented as a result. Visitors hear about individual tragedies, but rarely connect them. Each story fades independently, never forming a larger picture. Without that picture, concern remains abstract. Abstract concern rarely motivates change. Families of the missing exist outside this protective narrative. For them, patterns are not theoretical. They recognize similarities through shared experience. They encounter the same obstacles, explanations, and silences. Their questions often go unanswered, because answering them would require acknowledging connections that officials avoid. The refusal to acknowledge patterns also limits learning. Without collective analysis, mistakes cannot be identified systematically. Search methods are repeated without adjustment. Reporting standards remain unchanged. The same uncertainties persist across generations of cases. Acknowledgement would force a shift from reactive response to proactive examination. It would require asking uncomfortable questions about terrain management, visitor education, and emergency protocols. It would expose gaps that have long been normalized. That exposure carries risk, but it also carries opportunity. The wilderness itself does not demand mystery. It demands respect. Uncertainty exists whether it is acknowledged or not. Pretending otherwise does not reduce risk. It merely delays understanding. The argument is not that national parks are inherently unsafe. It is that safety is not absolute, and pretending it is creates blind spots. Blind spots allow patterns to form unnoticed. Noticing them is the first step toward addressing them. Acknowledging patterns would not solve every disappearance. It would not provide instant answers. But it would change the conversation. It would shift focus from individual blame to collective responsibility. It would replace silence with inquiry. The resistance to this shift suggests how disruptive it would be. Patterns challenge comfort. They complicate narratives built on certainty. They force institutions to admit limits. That admission is difficult, but necessary. Until that acknowledgement occurs, disappearances will continue to be framed as isolated misfortunes. The larger questions will remain unasked. The same uncertainties will repeat. The final truth is unsettling but simple. Patterns exist whether they are acknowledged or not. Ignoring them does not make them disappear. It only ensures they remain unresolved. And as long as acknowledgement is avoided, the next disappearance will not be an anomaly. It will be part of a pattern still waiting to be named. America's national parks remain places of beauty, freedom, and escape. But beneath that image lies a pattern that has never been fully confronted. Disappearances continue to be explained one at a time, separated from one another, and quietly closed without true understanding. What's left behind is not evidence of chaos, but of repetition. Similar circumstances, familiar silences, and unanswered questions that refuse to fade. Until those patterns are openly acknowledged, certainty will remain elusive, and the wilderness will continue to remind us that some truths are not hidden by distance or darkness, but by the refusal to look at them together. The question isn't whether these disappearances will continue. It's whether they'll keep being explained away one by one. Pay attention to the patterns others ignore. Notice what's left unanswered. Because once you start connecting the dots, this story doesn't end here.